Okay, hi guys. This is going to be the first of a two-part series this week. We're going to be looking at the Yakama War and the Dawes Act here in the first part. So this is taking a look at Washington State in the years 1855 up until 1887, so just before Washington Territory becomes Washington State in 1889. Last week we looked at the Stevens Treaties um, and talked about their impact and a little bit about how those articles in the Stevens Treaties impacted both Native Americans in Washington Territory as well as the settlers here in our region too. So we're going to kind of go back to the Stevens Treaties real quick at the beginning of this video, and we're going to talk about the Treaty of Walla Walla. This happened in 1855. This is the treaty that Isaac Stevens made with a lot of the Plateau tribes. So these are tribes like the Nez Perce, the Walla Walla, the Yakama, really powerful Plateau tribes that had a lot of influence in that region. The tribes on the plateau were a lot larger than some of the coastal tribes, and they were really powerful. And Stevens really feared that these tribes would band together in some kind of large alliance and potentially attack Washington. So what he did is he purposefully split up the reservations, divided them, and moved them around into areas really far away from each other and away from their original territory. Some of the larger tribes, like the Nez Perce and the Yakama, they were given really large reservations, and the smaller tribes were kind of pushed aside and forced to agree to the agreement. Unfortunately, after the Treaty of Walla Walla was signed, gold was discovered by miners that were trespassing on some of the Yakama land that was along the Columbian River. We've seen this before in treaties that was made with Native Americans on the Great Plains and in the Rocky Mountains. So this is just kind of following a pattern. This keeps happening. The United States gives them a reservation, they sign a treaty, and then miners find gold on their land, and all of a sudden people are rushing in to take that land as quick as possible. So that happens here to the Yakama. They actually protest to Governor Stevens. They ask him to help them out, and he orders whites not to enter their land. But the miners don't really care. Governor Stevens doesn't really have any intention of doing anything about it, and they keep coming anyway. So some of the bands of the Yakama get fed up, right? They are upset that from this mistreatment, and they start to kill some of the miners. This is what kicks off the Yakama War. U.S. soldiers were sent into the area to kind of quell the uprising and try to shut it down as much as possible. This picture right here is a picture of Chief Kamayakin. He was one of the chiefs of the Yakama tribe, and he was kind of one of the leaders of this war. So right around the exact same time as the Yakama War is getting started, in 1856, there's a group of allied tribes that attack the, at the time, small town of Seattle on Puget Sound. This battle only lasts for a day, and only a few people are killed, but it causes a really big impact in the relationship between settlers in Washington and Native people. It basically causes many to believe in the fear of an all-out Indian war, and that fear is actually real. So people become very paranoid that these tribes are actually allying with each other and are actually planning on attacking all the settlers in Washington. That's not necessarily true, but because of these attacks and how close together they were in time, people start believing that that's the case. So again, the U.S. military retaliates. They start attacking tribes around Puget Sound and trying to track down the people that are involved. During this time period, battles are fought on both sides of the Cascade Mountains, right? They're fought on the east side of the state on the plateau, and they're fought on the west side of the state around the Puget Sound. The tribes actually do ally themselves together. So the Yakama allies with tribes like the Klickitat and the Nisqually here on the west side of the state. And one of the Nisqually chiefs was a guy named Weshai. He's right here, up here in the top right corner. He and his tribe were really upset about the Treaty of Medicine Creek, which is another treaty that Isaac Stevens signed with Native tribes, and settlers encroaching on their lands as well. So they joined together. Some tribes actually allied themselves with Governor Stevens and the settlers. So one of those tribes was the rich and powerful Snoqualmie tribe. Their chief is right down here on the right side of your screen, Chief Pat Canem. And what the Snoqualmie did is they actually blocked the passes over the mountains to try to keep the tribes from linking up together and helping each other fight against the government. And he led his warriors to try to hunt down Leshai, find him, and end the rebellion. So some tribes are fighting against the government, and other tribes are allying themselves with the government to try to help them out. Okay, so here's Governor Isaac Stevens again, and I wanted to show you this quote right here up at the top. So this is a quote from him, and this is one of the things that he said about the war. He said, "The war shall be prosecuted until the last hostile Indian is exterminated." Right, so basically what he's saying is we're going to keep this war up. We're going to fight it until every hostile Indian is killed and there are no more of them. Again, this shows his paranoia. This shows his fear that there is a statewide native rebellion and that it could erupt at any time. So what Isaac Stevens does is he actually does something really drastic. He declares martial law across the state. And for those of you who don't know, martial law basically means a military government. So you suspend ordinary law, the rights of people are being removed, and the military takes over and controls everything. So he kind of becomes like a temporary dictator for some time. He raises his own private army to track down the Nisqually and Yakama tribes along with their allies, and he even arrests white settlers that he suspects of helping them out. So again, Isaac Stevens is really concerned, right? He wants Washington Territory to become a state. He wants to protect settlers as much as possible, and he's going to do everything he can to make sure that he does that. What he does is actually pretty effective. He does start finding some of the tribes. He starts rounding them up. Leshai was captured and hanged, and Kamiakin, the Yakama chief, he fled to Canada. So he eliminated the leaders of the rebellion, and at that time, Snoqualmie warriors were sent out by Stevens to kind of track down the remaining tribes and force them to their reservations. So that's kind of how the war rounded up. It didn't last very long. It only lasted about 4 years. But it had a really dramatic impact on the history of Washington State and the relationship between the native people of Washington State and the settlers that were coming in. It really showed that Washington and its leaders were willing to go pretty far to make sure that the state was opened up for settlement. And it also showed that they were willing to ally with some native tribes against others in order to make sure that that happened. So it really split the native population as well. And some of those relationships between tribes are not very good even to this day. Okay, we're going to move on to talk about something a little bit different. So this isn't a war. It's actually a government act, like a law that was put into place in the United States, but it has a really big impact again on the relationship between Native people and settlers. You can see here by this news article right here, this is an advertisement that it was saved and it's from the Library of Congress. Sorry, my dog's going crazy right now. It says right here, Indian land for sale, get a home of your own, find lands in the West, right? So basically this is an advertisement to settlers saying, hey, you can buy native land, you can buy reservation land. How did that happen? How are we having here settlers buying up reservation land when we know before from the Stevens Treaties that that land was supposed to be for their own use and only their use? That doesn't quite make any sense. It's because of this. It's because of this law here called the Dawes Act. So the Dawes Act was originally supposed to be put in place because the United States realized that they screwed up. They realized that the reservation system wasn't working, it sucked, it wasn't helping anybody, and they wanted to try to reverse that damage by giving Native Americans real ownership of their land. Unfortunately, what this did is it actually had some pretty negative impacts on Native people and, again, their relationship with the white settlers. So the Dawes Act, what it did is it broke up the big reservations that were shared by a tribe into smaller individual portions of land for Native Americans to work and live on, just like the land that the settlers were buying for themselves and their families. What this act did is it actually opened up Native American reservations to settlement by both natives and whites, because the land that wasn't claimed by natives in the Dawes Act was then made available to whites to purchase so they could buy it from the government. Usually, just like how the reservations weren't good land, the land available was pretty rocky, dry, and useless. It wasn't very good for farming, which really sucks because one of the goals of the Dawes Act was to turn Native Americans into farmers, so it's not very effective. Some of the impacts of the Dawes Act are pretty long term. So again, remember the land that Native people were able to purchase wasn't very good. It wasn't very suitable for farming, so they couldn't be very effective at doing that. Once Native people claimed their land and they bought the title to it, they could apply for US citizenship, so they could become American citizens. But they had to break ties with their tribe. And so what that meant is they could no longer be a part of their tribe if they decided to become US citizens. And so this really weakens tribal ties and it weakens Native culture across the United States as some Native Americans decide to apply for citizenship and some decide to stay with their tribes. Much of the land in the Dawes Act was not claimed by Native people. Either they didn't really understand the process, or they weren't helped through it, or they didn't want it in the first place. And so that land that went unclaimed was snapped up by white settlers and land speculators. So a land speculator is somebody who like buys land to think that it, will raise in value later on. It's like a kind of like a real estate thing. So again, the Dawes Act is supposed to give Native people land. It's supposed to give them private ownership of that land and allow them to become citizens, but it really actually backfires and ends up making it so Indians have even less land and settlers are gaining more. Okay, in the next video, we're going to be taking a look at the Nez Perce War. This is a war that happened in Washington State and of many other states from June to October of 1877. So make sure to check out that video as well as you go along in your work this week.